Welcome back to Switch to Linux. It is Monday, and it is time for another Linux Top 5. And today we're talking about 5 Linux criticisms debunked. Now, these came from a discussion that is going on my video that happened a while back called 5 Reasons to Use Linux. And somebody left a comment on this just today, and I sent back a reply, and he sent back another reply, and so he wrote reasons not to use Linux. And he's very clearly an average computer user who needs to use some applications on Windows, and so he was responding to the video. So let me first start out by saying, if you are in that situation that there are certain applications you have to use on Windows, by all means, use Windows. If you're a gamer and you just love your AAA title games, use Windows. That's all good. This channel, though, is about teaching the average user, like you, how to use Linux to get your real work done. So maybe we need to do more tutorials or whatever else. But here are his reasons. I'll read my reply, and then he replied back to me, and I have not had a chance to reply back yet. But he says, installation aside, Linux forces you to use the command line. It has a lot of issues with drivers. It has issues with most games. It has issues with major programs like Adobe. The clone version of Windows program offer less and look more cartoonish. Fragmentation of distro and repositories. Every distro uses different kinds of packages. Above all, the nerdy community thinking because they know it, you should know it, and if you don't, then you're a loser. Linux is made by nerds for nerds. Buy a good antivirus. Don't ask this question in Linux, then the doors of hell will open up for you. Be careful of the websites you visit and use Windows. And he says the same security advice when you're on Linux too. All right, so actually this video is going to kind of address those comments, so we're going to get into that. And he replies back, he's looking at Mandriva a few years ago, looked at Ubuntu, looked at Manjaro a little bit, and then just is having issues. He's trying to run applications to compete with Photoshop. He's trying to look at Kdenlive, which he says is also available on Windows, as is Audacity. For audio, he looks at MS Office, LibreOffice, and I don't actually understand any of his criticisms saying they're simple and cartoonish. I actually am an expert in both Office and LibreOffice. LibreOffice actually has more functionality for the average user. There might be some things that it actually does do better, but I know that Microsoft Office, last I knew, does not handle labels nearly as well. It does not handle mail merge as well, unless you're, of course, buying Access, which is an extra $500 or $1,000 extra. All of that is included in LibreOffice for free. I mean, I write and produce my books entirely in LibreOffice. It is not simple, and it is certainly not cartoonish. So I don't understand that particular criticism, but he goes into some of these other things as well. And so what I want to do is look at 5 Linux criticisms debunked, because I think many Windows users may think that these are real issues, and they're not. And I'm going to explain these a little bit further. Number 1, issues with drivers. Here's a fun fact. Linux supports way more devices out of the box. Now, if you think that Linux has issues with drivers, you've never actually attempted to install Windows before. Or at least if you had, you have gotten a driver and utilities CD with your computer. So if you go into a big box store and you buy a Windows computer and you take it home, everything is going to work perfectly fine out of the box. The reality is you can buy computers with Linux installed on it that are going to work perfectly fine out of the box. It's just harder to come across them. You got to go to a System 76 or custom order a computer from Dell or HP or Lenovo, and you can get Linux pre-installed on that computer, and everything is going to work perfectly fine. But if you're taking a computer that you have laying around, and maybe the operating system doesn't work anymore, and you go to install Linux on it, you're going to find that Linux supports infinitely more hardware than Windows. On Windows, when you run the installation, and they've improved the process a little bit with Windows 10, when the installation runs, now you have to go in and install drivers. If you don't have that little disk of utilities and tools that came for your computer, you get to go on a hunt, and you get to look for drivers, high and low. And I hope that your wireless cards or your networking cards do not need drivers, because then you need to use a separate computer, download the files, bring them over, manually install them, and then you can get on the internet to do your search. The Linux kernel itself has a whole lot more hardware support than Windows ever probably will. It has so much support that your typical computer, install Linux on it, is going to work. You will find some issues with wireless cards. You will find some issues with graphics cards. If you're running an NVIDIA graphics card, you might have a little fight on your hand depending on your distro. If you are running an absolute bleeding edge computer, you are going to need the latest Linux kernels to run those, like the Ryzen Series 2s. You are going to need, I think it's Linux kernel 4.18 or above. It might be 4.17 or above. I'm not sure. I'm running this computer on a Ryzen 5 1600, so it's first generation, and I didn't have to install anything. Nothing. I put the stuff together. It has a Ryzen processor. It has a AMD R7 graphics card. I got the RAM in there. What else is in there? I've just the drives, the DVD drive, all that kind of stuff. Just threw the whole computer together, threw in my USB drive, and installed Linux Mint. No problems whatsoever. Drivers are not actually a big deal with Linux. There are a few things here and there, mostly either cutting edge or very, very niche software, or very niche hardware rather, that you might have a few driver issues with. But if we're talking about the average computer user, no, Linux actually supports drivers a whole lot more. Then you get into some of your distros, like your Ubuntu-based distros, has a automatic driver search tool where it's just going to search for anything else that could be installed as well. And then, Debian, that's pretty easy. Make one change in the configuration files and re-update the computer, simply reboot the system. It's going to go ahead and install non-free drivers. I mean, Linux does not have nearly the issue as drivers as you think. There are some, for sure, but it is actually not nearly as bad as Windows. The difference is you've got your Windows computer from a big box store. Everything works out of the box. No kidding, because that's the experience that Windows has done. If you buy a Linux computer that's pre-installed with Linux, you're going to have the exact same experience, but there's more devices you can install Linux on and not worry about drivers than there are on Windows devices and not worry about the drivers. So, issue number 1 with drivers, debunked. Number 2, forcing you to use the command line. What is this, 1999? No. I'm even running Arch over here, and I haven't touched the command line for a long time. Now, a lot of the people in the Linux community, when we understand how to use the command line, we love the command line. It is an amazing tool. It is very fast. It is very efficient. It does amazing things. But the reality is, here in 2019, when I'm recording this video, you do not need to use the command line on most Linux distros. I can go through pretty much all of them. Linux Mint is the one that I recommend most new users try out. Linux Mint, I don't really think you ever really have to use the command line. I really can't think of a situation where you would need to. Now, my Arch over here, sure, I got sick of the desktop environment, booted into the command line, and installed another one. So that I can change up the way the computer looks without changing the whole computer around. Did that through the terminal. Yeah, sure. But you do not need to use the command line for most things in Linux. There are certainly some things, and again, your Ubuntu-based distros, they make it easier by having some of the tools that you don't need to go into the command line as much. You can manually do things in the GUI with some of the tools they provide you. It's still faster and more efficient in the command line, but you don't have to use it. So no, you do not have to use the command line in Linux. Almost never. If you're hanging around on the Arch forums and they're giving you all that kind of stuff, or maybe the Gentoo forums, then yeah, if you're using those distros, you're going to need the command line a little bit more than if you don't. So no, you do not need to use the command line. That myth is debunked. Number 3, different packages for each type of Linux distro. So basically, this is what he says up here, that the fragmentation of distros and repositories, every distro uses different kinds of packages. No, that is not correct. Most Linux will fall under either Arch or Fedora/OpenSUSE or Debian. Now, Fedora/OpenSUSE, these are not super related, but they both use the RPM packages. So if I'm going to go, for example, I have a Brother Printers, which you see in the background, they make the drivers available from their website. So I can go onto there and I can pick either Deb or RPM. Download those drivers, single click install them, and I have a working printer. That's not exactly hard. In fact, it's going back to that driver issue. It is exactly the same thing. It is going onto the website, downloading the driver, and installing it, because that particular model, Brother Printer, does not work with open source drivers. And that's one of the few Brother Printers that doesn't. I've worked with a lot of different Brother Printers, and lucky me, I picked the only one without doing the research that didn't work as well. Oh well. But the point is, whether I'm on Linux Mint or on Ubuntu or on Debian or any of the thousands of other distros based on Debian, a .deb package is going to work just fine. If I'm on OpenSUSE or Fedora, those will both support the RPM packages, and I can download it and single-click install it on either one. That works just fine, just like doing it in Linux, or excuse me, in Windows. And then, of course, if you're in the Arch, you're going to hunt the Arch user repository to see what's in there. Of course, something like Manjaro is going to give you POMEC pre-installed, which you just go into your settings, enable the Arch user repository, and you will probably have what you're looking for. That one's a little bit hairy, but no, every Linux distro does not handle packages in different ways. Also, this criticism is no longer valid with the creation of snaps, flatpaks, and app images, which if you follow my channel, you know I'm not a huge fan of those, but that completely solves that criticism altogether. And you can pick either one of those as your option. So no, Linux distributions do not use different packages for each. In fact, that gap is closing more rapidly as we speak. So that myth is debunked. Number 4, viruses and websites. This is what he says. Buy a good antivirus. Don't ask this question in the Linux community, or the gates of hell will be open up to you. Be careful what websites you visit and use Windows. But he says the same security advice is when you have Linux too. Not necessarily. Most of the cases where you're getting some type of computer virus on a Windows system is maliciously installing an exe file in the background, which, unless you're using something like Zorin or something that has Wine installed on it, won't run. exe files do not run. This is why I tell people do not install Wine unless you know what you're doing and you absolutely need it on a Linux distribution, because Wine might allow you to run that one odd Windows program you want, but it also allows you to run viruses, which is not what you want. So with this one here, most of these cases, you are a lot safer on visiting a website on a Linux system than you are on a Windows system. Now, part of it is because the malicious code tends to run exe files, but that's not the only reason. The other reason is that the way Linux runs by default is a separation of user accounts. You have a root user on the system that can do anything. Your main user in many Linux distributions has what's called sudo privileges, which basically means do this as a super user. That's what it stands for, super user do. And that will allow your basic user, your current user, to run administrative privileges, but you always have to enter in a password. So if you're on a random website and the random website says, hey, download this thing and pops up your password, yeah, just go ahead and don't do that unless you were really expecting that. All right. And the reason is because Linux is built for multiple users utilizing the system, and it has that extra layer of security. Now, Windows can do that, but remember, we've went to the box store, we've bought our Windows computer, we've taken it home, and we've set it up. When you go through the Windows setup, the way they walk you through the Windows setup, your account is an administrator. And while it's possible to take your Windows system and isolate it out to make it more safe to use, the vastest majority of Windows users do not do that. The most people don't. So this is kind of a split difference. Linux by default separates those out. Windows by default does not separate those out. It is possible to run a Linux computer as root. It is possible to run a Windows computer not as an administrator. Okay, so with those in mind, understand that now your security vulnerability is the fact that most malicious websites that are going to infect your computer with malware is installing an exe file, which does not run on Linux. So you are safer on the internet on Linux because of this. Not entirely safe, just safer. And no, you generally do not need to run an antivirus, which in Linux, by the way, an antivirus generally searches for Windows viruses. So it doesn't really run anyway, unless if you are installing Wine on your system, definitely you want to run a Linux antivirus as well, because Wine will allow an exe file to run on Linux, and that is the thing that will open you up to more vulnerabilities. So that myth is debunked. Number 5, issues with some applications. This is an interesting one here because there is definitely some validity here. He talks about it has issues with major problems like Adobe. No, it actually doesn't have issues with Adobe. Adobe has issues with Linux. Okay? Adobe will not push out an edition for Linux. So, slight difference, but the same general conclusion that, yeah, you're not going to run Adobe products on Linux. Now, this is one of these ones where I look at this and I say, so what? When I first switched to Linux, I mean, I paid $1,000 for CS4 and I had it running on my Windows system. And I switched to Linux. Oh man, I gotta get this suite of software working on Linux. That's the way I originally thought. But that's like, why? What do I need to run? Well, Photoshop, Dreamweaver. You know that there's applications on Linux that do the exact same thing. Now, he says down here, because I responded back about this, and one of the things that he says you can't compare GIMP with Adobe. I radically disagree. The thing is that GIMP is not Adobe, and it is used a little bit different. But if you are fluent in GIMP and you are fluent in Photoshop, it doesn't make a bean cell worth of difference which one you use. They both do the same things. They do them in the same ways. You can utilize them for the same projects. There's some things that Photoshop does better than GIMP. There's some things that GIMP does better than Photoshop. The reality is, if you're struggling with it and you think that it's highly limited and whatever else, it simply means you have not taken the time to learn how to use it. Because I am proficient on both of them, and I actually prefer GIMP over Photoshop. Now, I am perfectly capable of using either one of them in very advanced ways. Again, I am an author. I do my own book covers. They get done in GIMP. I'm also a web developer, which means I'm always doing things inside of photo editing applications for clients, whether we're creating something, whether we are just resizing images, some advanced stuff, some basic stuff. Regardless, when I first made the switch over to Linux, GIMP was really hard to use. The reality is you take the time to use it, and it's very easy to use once you know how to use it. Every time you're getting a software application that is as complex as Photoshop or GIMP, it is going to be a learning curve. So you need to get through that learning curve. Don't sit back and go, I got to sit over here in my poopy diaper of Windows because Adobe won't work. You have to take the time to use the new applications, figure out how to run them. Very important. And then he's saying, sure, we're not going to get Microsoft Office running on here. LibreOffice is not simple and it is not cartoonish. So to show you that this is not simple or cartoonish, this is what LibreWriter looks like. So this is, of course, the open source, basically the open source version of Microsoft Word. For, I would say, 99.9 or greater percentage of users, this is going to do absolutely everything you need to do if you're writing a document. I use this application for producing all of my books. They get exported exactly in the format that I need, and they get sent out to printers all around the world without any issues. That's not simple. That's not cartoonish. Now, if he's talking about cartoonish, what the icons look like, you can change these icons. There's theming inside of this. If you want the toolbar, I personally think the toolbar looks more cartoonish, but you can actually install that if you want. This has a greater advantage because I have the ability to select our toolbars and I can customize it. So if I want to add some functionality to it, I can just go ahead and do this. If I don't need something like the field line, I can get rid of it. So I can produce myself one toolbar that has absolutely everything I need without any other issues. Other things LibreOffice can do out of the box is LibreOffice actually has the ability to run, here's the various templating that you have out of the box. You have the ability to do address labels, business cards completely out of the box. We have the ability to do mail merges, all sorts of really advanced things. So saying that that the applications available in Linux are too simple and don't actually function, I'm sorry, you have not taken the time to learn how to use them. Now, that's not a bad criticism on you because it can feel overwhelming and daunting, but that's why we produce videos to teach you how to use these types of things. And that's why I do have a lot of videos about mail merging, producing labels, things like this in LibreOffice. I even have some on producing books in LibreOffice. I have things on GIMP, entire tutorials on GIMP. I have tutorials on how to build book covers. I think I might have some on audiobook covers as well. So these applications are solid, good, robust applications, but they're complicated applications. You got to take the time to learn how to use them. But once you take the time to do that, they become second nature. So that issue as well is debunked. Now, are there cases where you need to stay on Windows? Absolutely. I'm not saying that there's not. I'm not telling everybody you're a noob for staying on Windows. You will never hear me say that. What I want you to understand is that there are options and that Linux is a lot easier to use than you may think it is. And it respects your privacy. It will keep you safer and you can get all your same work done. Whether I'm doing my web design hat or whether I'm doing my author hat, Linux does everything I need it to do. So that is my list of 5 Linux myths debunked. Let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. You can help support the channel with the links right above me or in the description down below. And follow me on social media if you want to keep regular updates on what's going on in the channel. So thanks for coming along, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.